Yes, I think this is such an apropos time to be having these conversations because so much is happening, not just in society, but also in the field itself. And
Yeah.
in terms of like continuous change, people got to be about what they're saying they're going to do, and who better to help them understand how to follow through than to have you join us and talk about what that follow through looks like. So
Thank you so much.
no problem. Let's get started. So, you wrote an op ed and it was called Courted, Booed Up, and Gaslit by Stanford, My Racist and Toxic Relationship with the Ivy League, which
Mhm.
great write up. I mean, it was,
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I know it's a lot. I know it's a lot.
but it was actually really refreshing to read as well, just
Mm.
because I think it highlights a lot of experiences that I think people, especially women, go through when they're starting in a new place, or they're being courted, so to speak, and then
Yeah.
you start to question, like, did that really happen? Are you
Yeah. Where's the
okay?
switch? What happened? When did things change? When did we move from
Right.
this phase to the next phase?
Exactly. So, can you tell us more about your experiences for those who haven't read the article? Like,
Yes,
what led you
yes,
to write it?
yes. I wish I had a cocktail. It is truly one that you would need that for. So for those of you who have not read my op-ed, it was exactly, I used that very candid, explicit title because that really surmises my experience at Stanford. So I was deeply rooted, I call, and planted in Houston. I was at the University of Houston. Shout out to all of my students, master level, doctor level students. I loved my students. My students loved me. I was really deeply embedded in the Houston community. Houston become a second home for me. I'm originally from Louisiana, so I'm a Southern girl at my core. And if there's anything that I can recognize, both blatantly or indirectly, or just in the ways in which it manifests in an insidious way, it's racism. And so I was very well acquainted with it in the South. And so the West, though, the West started calling. So I was, like, oh man, this is so progressive, right? This is some of the pushback I've gotten
Right.
against some racist people in my comments about how much of a progressive and liberal institution Stanford is. And so this is just another person crying racism where it is not. And that's just not the case. And so I went with that posture of they're liberal, they're progressive. In fact, my therapist, even at the time, shout out to Dr. Jimenez, was like, yeah, you need an institution that is, ripe for the work that you do. Because I was doing this work in Houston, and was very well supported in it. And so, as I put in the op-ed, for those of you who have not read it, you can check it out on my LinkedIn page, Dr. LaWanda Hill on LinkedIn. And part of the joke in my circle was like, man, if people don't court me like Stanford, they must don't want me, because it was very clear that they were
Mhm.
interested. And, I still have a lot of respect, love, and admiration for my former supervisor, Dr. Bina Patel, who is the director of psychological and counseling services over at Stanford. I still respect her a lot. And she was the person who was part of the courtship. My colleagues were part of that. And so, she was like, basically, we'll wait until I needed to wrap up. I think we were in the middle of a semester at Houston.
Mhm.
Um, it was so much going on. Again, I was very deeply rooted. So it took me a while to wrap up. I had a private practice. I was teaching.
Mhm.
I was doing
Mhm.
community work. So I had to wrap up. So anyway, I get to Stanford. The timeline is in the op-ed. I get to Stanford, and I am just like, excited to get to work. And I won't ever forget. I have a memory like an elephant. So I really won't ever forget words or conversations. It's like it's
Mhm.
stored for me. And the hiring manager was kind of like, yeah, our Black students are thriving. They just need extra support. And when I got there, that was not the case. They were not thriving. And in fact, it became very quickly, I realized that there was a theme that the Black students were facing. It's not an inclusive place, let's call a spade a spade. And for the people who thrive there, it is because of the Black Community Service Center, who has created an incubator for Black students, and certainly brown students. I mean, there are several different cultural centers that incubate the students of color
Mhm.
from the nature of Stanford, which is intended for wealthy white children.
Right.
And so, I get there, and there's a thing with students. Students aren't thriving; they feel excluded. I mean, so much horrendous stuff happening in the classroom, y'all. Like, You name it was happening in the classroom. And of course they hear, because and then on top of this, Stanford had a problem retaining clinicians of color.
Right.
So it's been a while since there's been clinicians of color, but then apparently a lot of us got hired at one time. So the students are now back over the caps, like, oh my God, we finally got some help. And I was listening to the stories, like, okay, maybe this is a student problem. Nope. Because one thing about Black people, we're not a monolith, but for those of us, we are communal. And a lot of the Black people at Stanford was calling me like, hey, just want to check on you. It felt very communal. So when I go in about Stanford, I'm not talking about Black Stanford. Let me be very clear about that. So they were like, how are you doing over at CAPS? And I was just like, okay, what happened at CAPS? Because everybody's checking on me. Soon I learned Black staff had gotten it the worst. Because I want you to think about higher ed in terms of the way it's fractioned off. I'm pretty sure you're familiar. You have students
Mm-hmm.
who at Stanford really drive the revenue. They really
Right.
drive the program and the attention, and then you have the faculty. But faculty is really protected because there's a lot of white supremacy within faculty, tenure, and all these things, and so they're very untouchable in a lot of ways. So it's the
Mm-hmm.
staff who really get the short end of the stick, because the staff is not necessarily looked after by alumni. They're not faculty in that way. So I begin to see several issues with Black staff, and so but because I was doing well, a lot of people are very shocked that I left Stanford, because I was doing very well at Stanford. I had advanced at Stanford. I was, you know, very well known and respected by the administration. But the nitty gritty of it, which I'm pretty sure we'll talk more about, was
Mm-hmm.
exhausting. It was exhausting. And to learn, I was getting on all ends. So Black students are traumatized because of their experiences, and I'm having to treat Black staff. I eventually started and chaired the Black Coalition at Stanford. So I'm hearing the issues that Black staff are having. And this is cyclical. This wasn't new. This was just something that occurred and people just dealt with it. The numbers are there. The numbers are in the op-ed. And then I was experiencing it as a person. So beyond just being the chair, being a clinician, just being a Black person at Stanford and always having to be the one, I embrace critical conversations. I think they move issues forward, but
Mm-hmm.
having to do that every day, all day, was exhausting, and it took a toll. And eventually, I was like, we breaking up. Like I can't do this. I can't do this no more. It's not it for me. I got to move on. That's the
Right.
that's the cliff notes.
Yes.
That's the quick and dirty cliff notes of what happened at Stanford.
I mean, just being in that middle ground position, I think,
Mm,
and having those discussions, you talked about the exhaustion. It's, I mean, it's amazing that you held on, and especially knowing a lot of the conflict that was taking place on the
mhm.
campuses.
Mhm.
It's
On
like,
multiple ends. On
right,
multiple ends. It was like, I mean, and because I was, as a clinician, of course, you know what's happening from your student's perspective. And so you're taking that in. But also as the chair of the Black Coalition, one of the first things that we did was issue out, these surveys and these analysis to really get a pulse of people's mental health, because I'm a clinician, mental health and well-being, the incidents that they had at Stanford. And I can't name them because I think people would know, because it's such a small
right,
Black community. But
right,
like, I was like, damn, like this is just really the reality of what people are experiencing. But because people are afraid of
right.
retaliation, or because people revere this as a elite institution, people were having a hard time addressing these things outside of the walls of
Yeah.
what felt psychologically safe for them.
Well, you talked about the traumatizing experience of many of the trauma that many of the students experience and the staff experience. How did you cope with your experiences that were
Ooh, girl.
traumatizing?
Here's the thing. I think I was negligent with myself. If I'm being very honest,
Mhm.
I had some very unhealthy coping mechanisms initially. So I had moved to Stanford. I was in a bliss. So I didn't have a therapist in California yet.
Okay.
And so I hadn't had a therapist yet. And so I just kind of like threw myself into work. And so initially I was absorbing it. It wasn't until I really had my first and last panic attack that I realized that I wasn't managing the stress. I was just like, wait a
Yeah.
minute, am I having a heart attack? It was just literally, we were getting ready to
Right.
meet with the president of the institution, and I was writing the executive summary about everything. And I was just like gasping for air and felt my arm tightened and my chest
Yeah.
pounding and feeling like this intensity of anxiety. And I was like, oh, I think I'm overwhelmed. Like I think my body is keeping the score and I'm overwhelmed. So I really wasn't managing my stress well at all until I got to a point where my body was like, hey, we
Right.
can't do this. We can't do this no more.
Well, if you don't deal with it emotionally, it will come out in one way or another.
It will. And it
Like, I
physically
need your
came
attention.
out. Exactly.
Right. So, you know, given that you recognize that you didn't have the healthiest coping mechanisms, you were just kind of going, which is also something that I think a lot of students and a lot of staff do, especially in academic setting. You know, there's always a pressure to produce. I'm
Mhm.
thinking about that and wondering what are the most common forms of workplace trauma in academia,
Ooh,
particularly
ooh,
experienced by
that is
Black
a
and
great
BIPOC staff.
question. That's a very, very good question. What's the most common traumatizing experiences? I think you said
Yeah.
in academia, gaslighting. I think that when you are a minority in these spaces and people are either unaware or intentionally manipulative and there's no representation, you are gaslit often. And so for those of you who don't know it, well, we're talking to therapists, so therapists know what gaslighting is. And so when you're gaslit all the time, even though you feel very firm in who you are, you're questioning yourself. So one of
Yeah.
the experiences that I write about in the op-ed was when I was curating the vigil for Black Lives, following the murder of George Floyd. And I was, tasked with curating that from start to finish with some more peers. And I was, putting together the flyer. And I was like, I need a flyer that's really going to represent the community. And so I picked the traditional Black fist. And I submitted the fist to the department who was creating the visuals. And they sent me back a white fist. And part of gaslighting is
Wow.
making you question, am I crazy? Like, I was like, hey, surely they wouldn't do that. Like, you would not take a vigil for Black lives where you're supposed to be honoring and then like honoring Black lives who've been struck down, life taken prematurely by state sanctioned violence, and you would not plaster a white fist on this message. So I know but you're in it, but because it's so blatant, So I'm asking my peers, like, hey man, like, did y'all see this? Am I crazy? What do y'all see? And everybody was like livid, like that is a white fist. So you send it, you push back, and I'm like, hey y'all, this is upsetting, and the dismissal and
Right.
the, oh, you're overreacting, oh, it's not a big deal, oh, I don't understand why you're even behaving in this way. That to me is that's part of the trauma, like the gaslighting.
Mhm.
I also think a secondary trauma, I think a lot of Black people, specifically Black and brown folks more broadly, are incubators for other people who are in these institutions, meaning that they hold space for them or they try to protect
Right.
them. And so you're absorbing, I can't say the word,
You're probably
absorbing.
doing both, observing
Yes,
and absorbing.
absorbing. My southern accent is coming in. A lot of the experiences, and so it's like secondary trauma. I think, and here's the piece that I broke down. I did an interview a couple weeks ago with Melanie in Mental Health about this.
Mm.
There is what I refer to as white toxicity. And white toxicity to me is the ways in which people are conditioned to show up in a way, mask in what's permissible because of their racial identity that eats away at your mental health. And that could be
Mhm.
whitewashing of history of what happened. That could be
Uh-huh.
gaslighting. That could be white centering, right? Centering white discomfort. That could be white fragility.
Mhm.
That could be the microaggression. So you have this ball of toxicity that
Mhm.
manifests at every, whether let's say your day starts at 9, if you're managing white fragility at 9, white toxicity at 10,
Right.
gaslighting at 11, secondary trauma at 12, microaggressions at 1, and then you're dealing with white discomfort and having to center that and be on edge from 2 to 4, your whole day is filled with
Yeah.
trauma. Your
Yeah.
whole day is filled with a stress response that's been activated the entire day,
Right.
that is never gone out, and it's just exhausting. So I think white toxicity in all the ways in which it manifests,
Mhm.
and that doesn't necessarily have to be attributed by people who identify as white, because people can be white
Right.
aligned,
Right.
or white identified, or have internalized white supremacy values. And so I think that those experiences that people think are small and one-offs, but they're really chronic and persistent, is what contributes to our traumatization. Is what erodes our mental health.
I think the fact that you pointed out how frequent they can be, um, and how pervasive that they are. I love that you talk about it as white toxicity, and that it doesn't have to come from a white person. It could be someone who
Mm-hmm.
has white supremacist thoughts. We're not here to talk about it, but you have done a lot of talk about decolonization of psychological processes,
Mm-hmm.
therapy, etc. And so I think identifying those particular things that are
Yeah.
reflective of white toxicity is really important,
Mm-hmm.
and a
Mm-hmm.
question that I think we should be posing to our clinicians, like how are we identifying that with our clients so that we can help them
Mm-hmm.
prepare themselves or at least stem the tide of those experiences. So I
Mm-hmm.
really
Mm-hmm.
appreciate that, highlighting that point. So thinking about this and seeing like your students constantly going through this as a clinician, like your caseload and the staff, what would you say now are some of the red flags that higher education and the institution might be full of um, in terms of
Ooh.
racism or various biases?
Mm. Red flags is always high turnover.
Mm,
Be aware of places where there's a turnover of black and brown or marginalized folks. That means the place has recruited them, but they haven't done the work to retain them.
right.
I think another red flag is Stanford does this thing that I refer to as trauma porn. I remember sitting through one of their recruitment sessions, and they would do these things like the students would ask, these are potential students, so they're not necessarily admitted yet, and they were like, we want to hear your most devastating experience. We want to hear how you had to
Mhm.
overcome such horrible or tough. They would never say horrible, tough circumstances, and so you're soliciting people with trauma experiences. And
Right.
my perception of that is that you want to be perceived as a savior, and so you're
Yeah.
going to bring them in, and then you're going to put them through an institution, and it caps, psychological services on the university center in short-term therapy. You
Hmm.
cannot serve everybody long term, so you're bringing them in without the resources to serve them, but to be perceived as, to me, is tokenism. And so I
Hmm.
think red flags is when you have these spaces of people who are being heavily recruited and being admitted by their most horrible experiences that they've had to overcome. Because it's not like you're recruiting them with the intent to provide a plethora of resources to help them overcome it, but just to say, look, we recruited LaWanda from the South, one single parent household filled with trauma and gun violence, all of the things that
Right.
that that tokenize people. I think that's definitely a red flag. You know, Another red flag for me was the mental health and well-being of the black and brown staff. Pay attention to that, because I think that the health and well-being of your most marginalized or minority people in your institution will tell you just how inclusive or uninclusive or divisive it is, because
Right.
that meant we spend the majority of our time at work, and so if these people are not well, which I was hearing, or that's a red flag for me. And one of the biggest key indicators that I should have peeped game on is that this kind of happens. What company was I working with? But this happened at Stanford specifically. Who's in leadership? What's the
Mm-hmm.
representation in leadership? Because you may have, like Amazon, you may have 20% black people, but if 15% of them work in the factory,
Right.
and no, and only 3% work in senior level leadership, then it's racist. Why? What is racist? Is unequal distribution by race, and so
Right.
therefore you see it that you can come here, but there's a cap. So these are the
Right.
red flags for me specifically.
Well, I think it's such a valuable point. Like, who's getting tenure? I think of like Cornell West and his experience of not receiving tenure.
No,
And,
exactly.
like, it's Cornell West. How do you
It's
not?
Carmel. Nicole Hannah Jones, she won a Pulitzer Prize from
Right.
1619, and they had the nerve to not try to give this woman a position.
Exactly. So when you say like you're not seeing the representation in leadership as a red flag, and there are so many institutions like that. So it
Yep.
really does make us have to think about, okay. And
Mm-hmm.
this is my little soapbox issue. There are places that are going out and having, bringing in lots of folks to do DEI and try to, create supportive environments. But again, that turnover is high because they're bringing
Yeah.
in something and not giving them
And who do
credit.
they report to, and what's their power? right?
Exactly.
We experienced this
Exactly.
at Stanford. Where do they sit, and what do you want to give them this, a symbolic
Mhm.
power, or is it truly transformative power? Do they report to the provost? Do they report to the president? Do they
Right.
report to the VP of student affairs and so forth? Like, and I will say, even with representation, I want to provide a nuance there, because I do think that some institutions will put Black and brown folks in power. They have to be more white aligned in thought,
Yes. Yeah. Thank
and
you.
colorism plays a role in that, centering white discomfort. And so there was always these tokens, that
Mhm.
would be in power, but sometimes those tokens in power are white aligned in a lot of ways.
Yes. We're not going to talk about the Supreme Court.
Yes, that's classic example. Okay.
That's
All
a
right.
great
Classic
example.
example.
But now we have Ketanji Brown, so I do
Yes.
think that we're going to see some definite shifts, which is great. But
Yes.
with all the lessons that you've learned, I'm curious, especially since the hashtag Black in the Ivory hashtag was created. Has
Mm-hmm.
there been any notable progress in the past 2 years?
At Stanford, or just black in the ivory? No, I can say that with certainty. Let me tell you why. Because I have a workshop every fourth Friday of the month for Black women leaders across the U.S. To basically, it's an executive leadership development workshop, and we focus on some of the skills that are necessary to be a leader: emotional intelligence, the capacity to have critical conversations, and the capacity to navigate relationships, which is inevitable for any leader. And they represent monthly all
Hmm.
the Ivies, all tech, you name it, and their
Hmm.
experiences are still the same. And it's validating in a sense, because that's why I wrote the op-ed, to put it out there.
Hmm.
But it's also very disheartening, because it means that I don't think the Ivies and Ivy pluses of Stanford is in a space yet where they feel compelled to have a strong pivot.
Right.
It's not enough heat yet. It's just few
Right.
voices. It's a few voices, that have cried in the wilderness, but I don't think that they've had enough heat yet
Hmm.
publicly
Hmm.
to pivot such that we can really see transformative change.
That is a big. It's
Hmm.
huge because how do you bring the heat when you have these people who are positioned in a way that they're writing the laws, they're writing the rules, like they get to
Hmm.
and not choose, choose and basically
Hmm.
dismiss, you know,
Hmm.
experiences of many of the people that are coming to them saying this was my experience.
Right.
Um, so I want to ask, like, how do you create that heat? This is a
Hmm.
completely different concept,
I know. I know. This is what I love. This is what I get paid to do. So I believe in emergent strategy. I definitely believe
but
that small fractal changes can make bigger changes. I think that there's so much, I think people underestimate the power of their voice. And it's what happened with me too. It's like you believe that you're up against where you are up against the big bad wolf, who has seemingly all the power, all the resources, all the things to shut you up. And then enough people come together, and then you have a movement. And I believe part of the heat is critical conversations. I believe part of the heat is public accountability. The reason why I wrote the op-ed was several fold, but a large piece of it was public accountability. You have
right,
to really challenge people with what they care about. I don't think Stanford cares about Black and brown people, but I do think that Stanford cares about its reputation.
right.
And so the way that I have to get your attention is to challenge your reputation. And so I think that we, in our voices, and people experience this, because I've been seeing a few um, articles to come forth on LinkedIn,
Yeah.
at spaces like Harvard, at spaces like Yale, that have had similar experiences. People are tagging me on, like, you read this, LaWanda, you read this. So I'm like, okay, more of that. Like, I want people to have courageous conversations, and I get it. I know that when I write this in the op-ed, a lot of people, or the silent majority, will have to endure,
Hmm.
or have to choose other places that are less toxic. But I just wonder what we could do with that majority if we were to
Hmm.
really raise some noise about, what truly happens in these ivory towers,
Hmm.
to Black and brown people and marginalized folks.
I think even that perspective, like Language has such a huge impact. And I know we often hear, the perspective of the minority or the minoritized group, and I think that language somehow makes us feel like we're still a small number. And
Yeah, we're the global majority.
exactly,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
when you talk about making those fractal changes, if we start to recognize that we are a majority, I do think that heat can come about. So I appreciate you talking about starting
Mm-hmm.
and being emergent. And it makes me think of the African/Nigerian. I hear Nigerian proverb. Sometimes I hear African proverb, the
Mm-hmm.
continent.
Right.
If you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far,
Yeah.
go together.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
that has historically, I think, not happened. Like people going together, or when they start going together, it's immediately like broken down. And so
Mm-hmm.
being able to
Mm-hmm.
stay the course, I think, is really important. And so while
Mm-hmm.
we're talking about like what we can do, what do you think that white scholars and professors can do, those that make academia do to make academia supportive and to make it equal? Like how do they
Mm-hmm.
leverage Black professionals to instigate those changes?
There's a framework that I use. I own a DEI firm, and so we work with a lot of big companies, corporate, academia, tech companies to help make them more inclusive. And so this question comes up a lot. And so part of the framework that I use, I forget who's the original source. I'll have to quote it, but it's knowing, being, and doing. I think a
Mm,
lot of people want to jump to doing, and doing without awareness is harmful. We've seen that in the last 2 years post, what I fed up rising after George Floyd. But
mhm.
there's the knowing, the being. I think that people have to learn to be. I say this, and I say this ad nauseum, but I believe it. Nobody escapes conditioning and socialization.
Right,
This country is conditioned around anti-blackness. This
right,
is a heteronormative, cis, white-centered country. So
right.
the chances are high, if you are white identified, that you have been conditioned to be centered. And I want to invite you to just start very simple of being in spaces where you're not the majority,
Mhm,
being in spaces where you are the minority voice, being in spaces where you are uncomfortable, and just feel what comes up for you and see what
mhm.
comes up for you, and let that be. Yes, there's several resources. There's, how to be anti-racist. There's white fragility. There's DEI training. There's transformative, much of which we offer at Heal Psychological, shameless plug, and Heal Psychological and consultation services. But part of the work is about being and understanding your conditioning. That's one. If I would say this is a pie chart of what I would advise, I would say I would start with the 50% being, and I would start with the 50% of sitting with the discomfort of relinquishing a level of power for equity.
Mm, mhm.
So, equity is about redistributing power, resources, information, knowledge, tools, finances into a group that has historically been underrepresented. And for a lot of people, that feels threatening. And a lot of people, that feels uncomfortable. And that's the very thing that they are doing to other groups, right?
Right.
Like, what? Right. And so I think that 50% of being and 50% of doing the work to do equity, to center
Mhm,
other groups, is a piece of the puzzle,
mhm,
because we are behind. I think this woman out of I forget where she's from, this black woman who was doing the Fed Up Rising, but she talked about comparing where we are to a game of Monopoly. So
mhm.
when you play Monopoly, it's about, obtaining wealth. And when you go around the goal, you collect $200. Every time you pass go, you collect $200. But for 400 years of enslavement, black people across the diaspora did not collect $200. And then when we finally could collect $200, we had to hand that money over to the oppressor, hand it over to the people who were already wealthy. We're uneven, we're
Yeah,
unequal. And
yeah,
so the only way to get the 400 plus years of $200 that we did not collect was for you to start redistributing where that's going to go, for there to
mhm,
be equity, right? For there to be true equity. And people want to do symbolic things to make these people feel better, but they don't want to give up their distribution of power. They don't want to give up their piece of the power.
yeah. There is a wonderful, I guess it was a TikTok, but it was posted on LinkedIn. There was a wonderful quote this woman said, literally, this is what Black people think about when we talk about distribution of resources. And there's all these
Mm,
things like billions of dollars go to Ukraine, millions of dollars allocated for this particular resource. A law for Stop Asian Hate has been codified. And then immediately. And then you have, this is what Black people actually get. And it's like a picture of Congress kneeling, everybody's wearing.
Exactly. Kente cloth, them changing the plaza name to Black Lives Matter, them giving us Juneteenth off, symbolic change that we didn't ask for.
Right. And it's definitely not equitable.
It's not equitable. But that's the insulting piece to me, because that tells me the people in power feel like, oh, let's just give them something that symbolizes change. Not necessarily resources, not necessarily finances or money or so forth. And so that, and here's where people have less patience for these conversations, which I understand, because of that kind of insulting acts of symbolic change as opposed to transformative change is why things don't shift, and why people are less likely to want to have conversations about it.
Right. And I think the big thing too is that these things that are being proposed or offered, it comes in ignorance and innocence, right? It's like, and we thought you would really like that. And it's like, but instead of telling us what is needed for, why not ask the question?
Because even that's still rooted in white supremacy, right? We know what's best, and we're going to do what we want to do. And we thought that would be best for you, as opposed to asking the people who know what's best for them, right? That's what I mean by the being. Even that. Hire you a DEI firm that is Black owned or minority owned, and have them tell you what work needs to be done. I assure you they know what to do. I assure you. It's just and then give them the space to do it. That's what, people in these academic institutions can do.
Right. So in thinking about what needs to change, or what do you need to do to create change, it sounds like this is exactly what you're talking about. Like, create space, give the space, give voice to, sit with the discomfort. I mean, that's the hashtag therapy quote of forever. It's not going to kill you. It's uncomfortable, but growth comes out of discomfort. And so,
see it through. Trust the process. Don't be, don't obstruct the process. If you read the op-ed, you'll see that the very thing that Stanford promoted me to do is the very thing that they end up implementing against me. You obstructed the process because you were uncomfortable. And so I think hiring consultants, when people want things done right, they go and hire folks. With DEI and equity, they feel like it's a free for all. Who interested? Nobody is going to send you to the Lakers and say, hey, who's interested in coaching the Lakers? Oh, you got an interest? Cool. Why don't you go coach the Lakers? Absolutely not. Who has a proven track record? Who has the skill? Who can deliver? Who has the capacity? We're going to screen you. Then we're going to send you to the Lakers because we want you to win, because that's how serious we take it. People need to take at that same level of seriousness. I can't tell you how many people have volunteers just leading the charge. Mostly sometimes white women, cishet white women, leading the charge, or people who have a minority of identity, like maybe gay men, but are missing the intersectionality piece, right, of the gender identity and the racial identity. And so a lot of the work continues to go undone. So it's just like, take it seriously as you would anything else, because it's that serious. It's people's lives.
And I think, to add to that, not just take it seriously, but understand what taking it seriously really means. Because I for at least 6 months, I felt like I was inundated with articles of people who were pulled into DEI positions and made chief executive officer of DEI. And then like 6 months later, they're leaving, and they're talking about why they're leaving. And it's like, it sounded serious when I took the role. Then why stand in the way? And what is that? And then how does that further damage, the psyche of the BIPOC community when you brought in someone, but now this person is leaving because they're not to affect the change that they were brought in to do. So it definitely is an important piece, one, to be serious, understand that seriousness is. And like you said, start with being. An
Mm-hmm.
interesting plug, being is the name of my business. And I did that for, it's holistic. Sitting in the sense of self in different places is so important, because often we don't, especially in the American culture. Like, we don't travel
Exactly.
as much as other countries. We don't do those things. And so I appreciate you saying not just no, which I think
Mm-hmm.
we have too much of in this country, but
Yeah.
sitting and before you get to the doing. A lot of people,
Exactly.
oh, I know, let me go do this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The road to hell is paved
Mm-hmm.
with intentions.
Exactly. Because there's a lot of things that we know, but there's a lot of things we need to unlearn. And I think being will help you figure out what you need to unlearn. People think what they've learned is what they should go and do. But
Mhm.
no, a lot of what we've learned about minority groups, if you just take Black folks in general, the richness and the diversity across our diaspora, it's great. There's more within group differences than there are between. So there's more differences amongst us than there are between us and other racial groups. And so, but you don't know that because historically you've only been painted a small picture, a very fragile, I mean, a very small, intentional, negative view of who we are. And unfortunately, when you're in a work setting and you feel uncomfortable, you can mistake that for real threat. You can
Right,
mistake that for, uh-oh, that's the stereotype. And so you would therefore then engage in a way that just confirms all these things that you
right,
think you know, but they're
right.
really not knowing. We have like so many stereotypes about us that people need to unlearn. You know, some stereotypes, I'll be fair, are rooted in some level of truth, but that doesn't
Mhm.
mean that that's always the truth, and that doesn't mean it's the truth for the whole group.
Right. It just wanna like, that should be a bumper sticker and, like, a billboard everywhere. It's
Exactly.
interesting that you bring that up. The truths, and I think the entire country right now is also having to confront that the truth
Yeah.
that they've known and have been taught is super inaccurate and
Yep.
super flawed. And
Yeah.
now we're at this point of having to rewrite a story,
Yeah.
not just about Black culture or
Yeah.
how Blacks have been treated, but how all stories, whether it's talking about the historical contributions of the Asian culture, or uh,
Mm-hmm.
Asian cultures rather, or
Mm-hmm.
historical contributions of Eastern Europeans. Like, there's
Mm-hmm.
so many different things that have been left out of history that are now starting to come to light, and people like don't know
And
what
it's
to
a
do.
crumble. It's an identity crisis, you know. And I will say,
Right.
you know, I think that that's part of it's an identity crisis for some people. This may be a hard truth to sit with, but I do believe that a lot of minority people have always understood the identity of America
Hmm.
because, you know, America has, you know, painted this picture of who they desire to be, and it's inaccurate. You know,
Right.
when that Declaration of Independence was signed, you still were enslaving people. You know what I'm
Right.
saying? When you was like freedom for all, you still had slaves who you
Yeah.
had ripped away. You There were still laws that were illegal for, you know, Black women to have any level of autonomy over their bodies. And so I think that I would even argue, as hard as it is for people to sit with, that there is a large amount of non-Black and brown minority folks coming to grips with America and who they are as a
Hmm.
culture. When people say that, we've always known. You
Right.
know, even sometimes when President Biden said, "This is not who we are," this is exactly who we are. This is
Right.
exactly who we are. This is exactly who we've been. And you can't deal with what you won't face. It's a very tumultuous time. It's a very scary time. Um, but I do think it's a very critical time for us to really
Mhm.
deal with who we are and the inaccuracies of who we proclaim to be,
Yeah,
to
I
get it
feel like,
right.
right, we're like collectively going through a therapy, you know,
Exactly.
sitting in some stuff, um, hoping to come out on the other end with understanding, or even just being able to work through it. And a lot of what you're addressing, I think, is super important. Like, just thinking about America and who we are right now. Like, this country was born out of hypocrisy, right? So you have
Hmm.
leaving for religious
Hmm.
persecution. It shouldn't be in our laws, but now our laws
Hmm.
completely invite religion, even though we're not supposed to. So
Exactly.
everybody's free, but yet we have slaves. There's constant states of
Yeah.
hypocrisy all throughout our
Yeah.
history.
Yeah.
And so all the work that you've been doing with, just being a voice, being an advocate, helping to educate, helping to hold these critical conversations and create that space
Mhm.
so that we can have this change over time is such pivotal work at this time while we're all mired in this, dare I say it, SHIT.
Yeah.
Um, it's so important to make sure that you are taking care of yourself and have some
Yeah.
help. So with all the things that you're working on, I'm curious, are there other projects that you're currently working on that you want to share with us?
Yes, I am working on two critical projects that I think really helps in a more transformative way deal with all the things that we've been talking about, specifically racism in academia, but not just academia, all industries. The core of this country is anti-Black globally, really. But for the sake of this conversation, we'll just talk about America as being anti-Black. So I have an executive leadership development workshop that I absolutely love because, man, these women are powerful beyond measure. And I gather with them every fourth Friday of the month from 5.5 hours. I've had to consistently extend the time because they always want more time. But there any Black woman in leadership, and this could be mixed race, Black across the diaspora, biracial, if as long as you identify as Black and woman, this is the space for you. And it's an executive leadership development workshop where we come together and we really explore the ways we've been conditioned to be. A lot of our
Mhm.
ancestors, baby boomers and up, were conditioned to survive, to get a seat at the table, right? Not necessarily to challenge the norms at the table. And so what I do is give people the space to be able to, one, understand how they've been conditioned, and then because I think we do things to survive. For example,
Mhm.
I don't, but I'm hypothetically, I may center white discomfort because I don't want you to be uncomfortable, because I know that white discomfort historically can lead to retaliation.
Right.
In the case of Emmett Till, it can lead to death. It could lead to termination. So I try my best not to discomfort you. So I center you. And so if I
Mhm.
know that that's my way of being conditioned because I'm trying to center your discomfort, what I help Black women do is take it a step further. What's the critical conversation you need to have about that?
Mhm.
Here's some of the historical things that come up for me that make it harder for me to have these conversations. I would, and then put your request in. I'm
Right.
asking you to consider your bias as opposed to
Mhm.
me doing all of the work for you to
Right.
be comfortable, right? And then the step further is to have a critical, I mean, to have learn how to navigate ruptures and repairs. This is the part that I
Mhm.
love. It's very experiential. It's very, yes, didactic in some ways, but it's community building, it's experiential, but you get a chance to role play and really sit with those tough conversations. Because
Yeah.
when you have these conversations with people, a rupture in relationship is inevitable. You're going to
Right.
experience a breaking connection, and we need to have the skills and tools to navigate it because we haven't been conditioned to navigate a rupture. We've been conditioned to maintain artificial harmony. And with
Right.
artificial harmony, we never address these things. So this is a big project that I'm working on. We do it every month. Our next one is tomorrow, actually. But the August, September, October cohorts are still open. So I hope Dr. Haley drops that in the chat because I really
Yeah.
want people to join a cohort of Black women leaders. And the second piece of that project is a 12-week coaching program. So we
Mhm.
do a big high level workshop intensive for 5.5 hours on fourth Fridays for Black women who many of which are the onlys in their spaces, or
Mhm.
they're few in the spaces. They get a chance to join another cohort of other Black women leaders for 12 weeks to take a deep dive into what I call the soft skills, emotional
Right.
intelligence,
Right.
effective communication, engaging in wellness practices, things that they're going to need because I believe, although we're in a tense moment, the climate is shifting. And people need
Yeah.
new ways of being and new tools to navigate the way in which it's shifting. And I like to be the person that holds space for that. So those are my two big projects that I'm working on, in addition to trying to, eradicate anti-Blackness.
And that's a lot. And definitely are going, and I mean, we appreciate so much the work that you're doing because, you know, one, you definitely need allies to make sure that
Sure.
it, you're not the only one who is supporting this change, right? it takes a village in many instances, but we need the leadership, and that's where you step in and you're showing so many people how to begin these conversations and stick with them, not
And
just
stick with them.
right, like not just turn the blind eye. It's never gonna work. Like, no, it can. Um, and just how to sit with that discomfort. I think, like,
Yeah.
aside from just doing this, like, this is another shameless plug. Everybody needs therapy, right? Find
Yes.
I don't care where the therapist is, but find one so that you can have a space to download as well and help see your own blind spots before you go
Hmm.
tell everybody what their blind spots are.
Right. Well, hello, somebody. Yes, everybody. There's only two type of people in the world: people in therapy and people who need to be. Remember that. So we need to be in the space. Whatever you need to do, if you need to come to all the Together Wells on Wednesday to get
Right.
beyond the stigma to go, I just think we're better when we're informed and when we have the tools to navigate the complexities of life.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, it's so important, and like, know that there's constantly growth, right? So just because you got tools right now doesn't mean these tools are going to work in the future. So you might need to come back and get a
Because
tutor.
baby, let me tell you something. This owning two businesses tools, I did not know the tools I needed for that. But here we are.
I always say it's a practice for a reason, right? Because
Hmm.
you're constantly growing and you constantly learning and how to apply. So, it it takes a certain mindset and takes a certain desire, and you have embodied that and shared so much with us. So we really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation and highlighting all these wonderful points. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us, or any major takeaways you want our viewership to have?
Listen, thank you for that question because I was just asking. I'm so committed to this work that every month I do offer a few sponsored tickets. So I'm going to offer you two sponsored tickets for either yourself and a colleague, or two of your clients who you think could benefit from this workshop. I am definitely going to give you
So
the promo code
awesome.
for that.
Okay.
I know everybody, it's a price point that not everybody can afford, but I don't want that to stop. I believe in this work. I really believe in it.
Yeah.
So I am going to definitely offer you the code for two sponsor tickets for you to see, to do with them as you may. And then I can do to Dr. Haley as well for people who are a part of the Together Well network. We have several cohorts and we have several seats.
Yeah.
So I don't think four will be a big hit.